I cradled my crying baby with one arm while serving dinner with the other. My husband barked, "Hurry up," as his mother watched with a smile. My body was still healing from labor. My hands shook. "She's always been dramatic," his mother whispered to him. I set the plate down slowly, looked at them both, and said, "Then you won't mind if I stop pretending to be strong in front of you." Neither of them laughed. Neither of them knew that by the end of that week, the woman they called dramatic would be the reason both of their comfortable lives came apart at the seams. My name is Vanessa Holt, and 11 days before that dinner, I had given birth to my daughter, Nora. 11 days. My stitches still pulled when I stood up too fast. My hormones were a storm I couldn't predict from one hour to the next. And somehow, in the eyes of my husband, Grant Whitfield, and his mother, Judith, none of that mattered as much as whether the potatoes were seasoned correctly. I want to tell you how it started, because it didn't start with a slammed door or a raised fist. It started with small, ordinary cruelties, the kind that are easy to explain away one at a time. Grant would sigh when Nora cried at night, like the sound personally inconvenienced him. Judith would show up unannounced to help, then spend the visit rearranging my kitchen and correcting the way I held my own daughter. When I mentioned I was still in pain from the delivery, Judith would tilt her head and say, "Some women just handle it better than others." She never looked at me when she said it. She looked at Grant, like she was reporting a fact about a stranger. I remember the first time it truly registered how coordinated their comments were. I had been up most of the night with Nora, who was going through a growth spurt and wanted to nurse every 90 minutes. By morning, I could barely keep my eyes open. Judith arrived at 9 with a casserole dish she didn't need to bring, since I had a full refrigerator, and the first thing she said when she saw me was, "Oh honey, you look like you haven't slept in a week." I said honestly that I hadn't slept much. She turned to Grant, who was pouring his coffee, and said, "See, this is what I was telling you about." I asked what she meant. She smiled and said, "Nothing, sweetheart. Just that some women bounce back faster than others. It's not a criticism." It was, of course, exactly a criticism, wrapped in enough sweetness that if I objected, I would be the one who seemed unreasonable. That became the pattern. Judith would plant a seed in front of Grant, disguised as concern, and Grant would absorb it without ever checking whether it was true. I started to feel like I was being observed rather than helped, like every stumble, every yawn, every moment of new mother clumsiness was being logged somewhere I couldn't see. When I dropped a bottle because my hands were shaking from exhaustion, Judith didn't ask if I was all right. She looked at Grant and said, "Has she always been this jumpy?" When I cried once, briefly, after a rough night, because that is a completely normal thing new mothers do, Grant didn't hold me. He asked if I thought I needed to talk to someone. Not out of concern for my well-being, but in a tone that made it sound like a box he needed to check. By week 2, I stopped mentioning the pain at all. That should have been my first warning. When you stop telling the truth about how you feel just to keep the peace, you're not keeping the peace. You're losing yourself one silence at a time. The night of the dinner, Grant had invited his mother over without telling me, which had become a habit. I was folding laundry with Nora asleep in a carrier against my chest when he walked in and said, "Mom's coming for dinner, so hurry up with that." Not, "Do you need help?" Not, "How are you feeling?" Just an order, delivered like I worked for him. I made dinner anyway, because arguing took energy I didn't have. Nora woke up screaming halfway through, and I picked her up with one arm while I finished plating the food with the other. That's when Grant barked at me to hurry up, and that's when Judith leaned toward her son and whispered that I had always been dramatic, loud enough for me to hear, quiet enough to pretend she hadn't meant to be heard. I set the plate down slowly. I looked at both of them, and I told them that I would stop pretending to be strong in front of them. Grant rolled his eyes. Judith smiled like she'd won something. Neither of them asked what I meant. That was their second mistake, because I never make a promise I don't intend to keep, and I had already decided, somewhere between the crying and the trembling hands, that I was done performing wellness for people who only respected me when I was silent. 3 days after that dinner, on day 14 since Nora's birth, I was up at 4 in the morning nursing her when I heard voices in the hallway. Grant was on the phone, his voice low but not low enough. I froze in the doorway of the nursery and listened. "She's not handling it well, Mom. I'm telling you, she's not okay. Maybe we should talk to someone. Get an evaluation, just to be safe." My stomach dropped. An evaluation. For me. Judith's voice came through the speaker, tinny and satisfied. "I told you weeks ago. New mothers get like this sometimes. It's not her fault, but you have to protect Nora. If something happened to that baby because Vanessa couldn't cope, you'd never forgive yourself." I stood in that hallway holding my sleeping daughter, and I understood, with a clarity that felt like cold water, that this was never concern. This was a setup. My husband and his mother were building a story about me, one exhausted night and one shaking hand at a time, and the story ended with someone else deciding I wasn't fit to raise my own child. I didn't confront them that morning. I want you to understand why, because I know some of you watching would have exploded right there in the hallway. But explosions confirm the story they were already telling. A woman who screams and cries and falls apart is exactly the woman they needed me to be. So instead, I did something Judith Whitfield never expected from someone she called dramatic. I got quiet, and I got smart. The next morning, I called my sister, Grace. Grace had gone through a difficult divorce 2 years earlier and knew more about family court, evidence, and protecting yourself on paper than anyone I'd ever met. I told her everything, whispering into the phone from the bathroom with the fan running so no one would hear. Grace didn't gasp or panic. She just said, "Start writing everything down. Dates, times, exact words. And Vanessa, get a doctor's note documenting that your recovery is normal for someone 11 days postpartum. Get ahead of the story before they finish telling it." That single piece of advice changed everything. The next morning, day 15, I made an appointment with my OB. I told her honestly how I was feeling, physically and emotionally, and she documented it in detail. Normal fatigue, normal hormonal adjustment, no signs of anything beyond what any new mother experiences. I asked for a copy of her notes. She didn't ask why. She just handed them over. Then I started paying attention in a way I hadn't allowed myself to before. I noticed how Grant would disappear for work calls that lasted much longer than any call should. I noticed how he'd angle his phone away from me at the dinner table, a habit that had crept in some time after Nora was born, like he'd forgotten I used to be someone he didn't need to hide things from. I noticed the new cologne. I noticed the credit card statement that arrived showing a hotel charge in our own city, on a night he told me he was working late at the office. I didn't scream. I didn't confront him with the statement in my hand. I photographed it. I filed it away with the doctor's notes and a growing list of dates, times, and exact quotes from every cruel or coordinated comment Judith had made in front of me. 2 weeks passed like that. I smiled at dinner. I asked Judith how her garden was doing. I let Grant believe his plan was working, that I was too tired and too overwhelmed to notice anything happening around me. Meanwhile, I was building a case, quietly, patiently, the way you build something that has to hold weight later. During that stretch, something happened that I never saw coming. Grant's older brother, Theo, stopped by one afternoon to drop off a gift for Nora. Theo had always been quieter than Grant, the kind of person who watched a room instead of dominating it. While Grant was outside taking one of his mysterious calls, Theo sat with me in the kitchen and asked, gently, if everything was all right. Something in my face must have given me away, because instead of pressing further, he simply said, "You know my mother has done this before, right? Not exactly this, but something like it. With my ex-wife." I hadn't known that. He told me, carefully, that years earlier Judith had spent months convincing him his first wife was unwell and unfit, feeding him doubts one comment at a time, until the marriage collapsed under the weight of suspicion Judith herself had planted. Theo said he only understood what had happened after the divorce was finalized, when it was far too late to see clearly. "I'm not saying anything is happening," he told me quietly, "but if you ever feel like something's off, trust that feeling. Don't wait until it's over to understand it." I didn't tell Theo everything that day. I wasn't ready to trust anyone completely yet, not even someone who seemed to be warning me out of genuine concern. But I never forgot what he said, and later, when the truth came fully into view, I understood that Theo had been trying, in his own careful way, to hand me a flashlight before I walked further into the dark. I kept documenting. Every evening after Grant left for what he called late meetings, I would sit at the kitchen table with Nora asleep against my chest and write down what had happened that day, word for word where I could remember it. I noted the specific comment Judith made about my jumpiness. I noted the night Grant asked if I'd thought about talking to someone after one brief moment of normal postpartum tears. I noted the hotel charge, the date, the amount, and the fact that Grant had told me he was at the office that same night. I kept photographs of every relevant document in a folder on my phone, then backed that folder up to an email account Grant didn't know existed, one I had created years earlier for freelance work and never bothered to close. Grace checked in with me every few days, and each time, her advice stayed the same. Don't confront them. Don't explain yourself. Let them keep talking, because people who believe they're winning rarely bother covering their tracks. She was right. Judith, in particular, grew almost careless in her confidence. She began saying things directly to me that she had once only said behind my back, testing how much I would tolerate now that she believed the groundwork had been laid. One afternoon, holding Nora without asking, she said, "It's better this way, honestly. Grant and I can make sure she's raised properly. You just focus on getting yourself well." I smiled, thanked her for her concern, and went back to folding laundry, while internally, I was cataloging every word for Renee. The twist came from somewhere I never expected, Judith herself. I was in the nursery one afternoon when Nora finally napped, and my phone buzzed with a message clearly meant for someone else. Judith had accidentally sent me a text she meant for Grant. It read, "Once the doctor confirms she's unstable, we file for you to have primary custody." I already spoke to Marilyn about property transfer options too, so if it comes to a divorce, the house stays protected on our side. Don't let her know any of this yet. Property transfer, divorce, custody, all planned, all discussed, while I was still healing from bringing their granddaughter into the world. I sat on the nursery floor with my daughter's soft breathing beside me, and I read that message 4 times, because some betrayals are too large to absorb on the first pass. I didn't reply. I took a screenshot. Then I forwarded it to my own email, then to Grace, then I deleted it from my phone entirely so it would never accidentally surface at the wrong moment. And then I called an attorney. Her name was Renee Castillo, recommended by Grace, a family law attorney with a reputation for being calm in rooms where everyone else was shouting. I brought her everything. The doctor's notes confirming normal postpartum recovery, the timeline of comments from Judith documented word for word, the hotel charge, and the screenshot of the text about custody and property transfer. Renee looked through it all with the kind of quiet focus that told me she'd seen manipulation like this before and knew exactly how it usually ended for women who didn't protect themselves in time. "You did the right thing staying calm," she told me. "The moment you react emotionally, they use it. The moment you have paper, they can't." She helped me understand something crucial. Grant and Judith weren't just trying to control the household. They were trying to build a narrative quietly so that if I ever pushed back against either of them, there would already be a story in place, a story about an unstable new mother, ready to be used against me legally if things escalated. The affair was a separate thread entirely, one Grant likely thought he could keep hidden as long as the custody plan gave him leverage first. Renee drafted a plan. We would not confront them the way they expected. We would let Judith's own words and Grant's own actions speak for themselves in front of the people who mattered. The opportunity came 2 weeks later, right around the 1-month mark since Nora's birth, when Judith insisted on hosting a family dinner so everyone could finally meet Nora. Extended family was invited: aunts, uncles, Theo and his new partner, a handful of cousins who rarely visited but never turned down a family dinner. Judith had clearly planned this evening as a stage for herself, a chance to be seen as the devoted grandmother holding a fragile family together. She wore a new dress. She'd had the good china out since noon. She stood at the head of the table with a glass raised, telling everyone how proud she was of her son for holding the family together through such a difficult stretch, her eyes flicking toward me just briefly enough for the room to understand what she meant without saying it outright. A few relatives glanced at me with the kind of soft, pitying look I had grown to recognize, the look people give someone they've already decided is the problem. Grant raised his glass along with her, playing his part perfectly, the patient husband enduring a difficult season. I sat there with Nora asleep in her bassinet beside me, and for one quiet moment, I almost let the toast pass. Almost. Then I thought about the hallway conversation, the text message about property transfer, the doctor's notes sitting untouched in Judith's mind while she built a story that had nothing to do with reality. I thought about Theo's warning, about his first wife, about a pattern this family had allowed to repeat because no one had ever stood up in a room like this and simply said the truth out loud. I waited until the toast ended. Then I stood up, calm, steady, my daughter asleep in her bassinet beside me. Before we move on, I said, I think everyone deserves to actually understand what stretch Judith means. The room went quiet. Grant's smile faltered. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I simply read from my phone the exact words Judith had texted about custody, property transfer, and using a doctor's evaluation against me before I'd even had the chance to see one. I read the date of the hotel charge and the date Grant told me he was working late. I mentioned, without elaboration, that my actual doctor's notes confirmed a completely normal recovery, notes I would be happy to share with anyone who doubted it. Judith's face went pale. Theo set down his glass slowly, his jaw tightening, as if a suspicion he'd carried quietly for years had just been confirmed in front of the whole family. An aunt covered her mouth. A cousin looked down at his plate, unwilling to meet anyone's eyes. Grant tried to speak, started to say my name in a warning tone he had used on me privately for weeks, but this time it carried no weight in a room full of witnesses. You're twisting this, he said, his voice rising. You're not well, Vanessa, and everyone can see it. Then it should be easy, I said, for everyone here to look at my doctor's own notes, dated over a week ago, confirming a completely normal recovery. I'll send them to anyone who wants to see them tonight. I'm curious whether either of you can say the same about the things you've been quietly arranging behind my back. Nobody moved. Judith opened her mouth, then closed it again, because there was nothing left to say that wouldn't confirm every word I had just read aloud. I looked at her, not with anger, but with the strange, quiet calm that comes when you finally stop being afraid of someone. I'm not dramatic, I said quietly, looking directly at Judith. I'm just done being quiet while you build a case against me to steal my daughter and protect a house that was never yours to protect. I picked up my sleeping daughter, thanked the few relatives I actually respected in that room for coming, and walked out with more dignity than I'd walked into it with in months. Theo followed me out to my car. He didn't apologize on his mother's behalf, which I appreciated, because it wasn't his apology to give. He simply said, I should have said something sooner. I'm glad you didn't wait for anyone's permission to protect yourself. It wasn't the last time his quiet honesty would matter in how things unfolded over the following weeks. What happened after wasn't loud or dramatic, because real consequences rarely are. The morning after that dinner, I called Renee and told her everything that had happened in that dining room, and she filed for a legal separation on my behalf within the week, using every piece of documentation we had gathered over the past month. She also sent a formal letter to Grant's attorney making clear that any attempt to use a fabricated instability narrative in a custody proceeding would be met with the full record, including the coordinated text messages and the independently documented medical evaluation. The letter alone was enough to end that particular strategy before it ever reached a courtroom. Grant's own family, The very people Judith had hoped would rally behind her narrative distanced themselves once they understood what she and Grant had actually been planning behind my back. Theo, in particular, stopped attending his mother's dinners for a long while afterward, and when I asked him why, he said simply that he couldn't sit at a table pretending he hadn't watched history repeat itself in front of him. He told me he had never fully trusted his mother's version of events about anyone after what happened in his own marriage, and that watching me stay composed while reading her own words back to her had confirmed, for him, exactly who the stable one in that room really was. Over the following weeks, Renee's investigator quietly built on what I had already found, pulling additional records that confirmed the hotel charge was not an isolated incident, along with a pattern of messages between Grant and a coworker he'd introduced to me once at a company event as just someone from marketing. Piece by piece, what had started as a single suspicious charge turned into a documented pattern spanning several months, which is what ultimately confirmed the affair Grant had been hiding. It didn't just end our marriage faster, it ended any leverage he thought he had. The evidence also undermined Grant's credibility during the legal proceedings, since it became clear he had been working to fabricate instability in me while conducting an affair behind closed doors. My documented, normal postpartum recovery, confirmed independently by my own physician weeks before any of this became public, helped demonstrate that the claims against me had no medical basis and significantly strengthened my position in the custody proceedings. I was granted primary custody of Nora, with supervised visitation conditions on Grant's side pending a full review, and Judith was named in the order as barred from unsupervised contact until the family court had reviewed the pattern Theo had described. Grant lost the house in the settlement, the same house his mother had been so eager to protect through her property transfer scheme. He moved into an apartment across town, and the last I heard, the relationship with his coworker hadn't survived the scrutiny either, since very few people want to build something new on top of a foundation everyone can see was rotten from the start. Judith lost her son's marriage, her daily access to her granddaughter, and, more painfully for her, the respect of the very family she tried so hard to impress with her performance of concern. I heard, secondhand, that she still tells people I was unstable after the birth. Nobody in that family believes her anymore. Some stories only work once, and hers had already been told, and disproven, in front of everyone who mattered. As for me, I moved into a smaller place with Nora, quieter, calmer, filled with exactly the kind of peace I hadn't realized I'd been missing until it finally arrived. Grace helped me paint the nursery that first weekend, and Theo, of all people, stopped by one afternoon with a second-hand rocking chair he thought Nora might like, an unspoken apology delivered in furniture rather than words. My hands don't shake anymore, not because life became easy, but because I stopped spending my strength convincing people who never intended to see me clearly in the first place. I think about that dinner sometimes, the plate I set down slowly, the words I said before I understood exactly what I was up against. I didn't know yet how far they'd gone. I just knew I was done pretending exhaustion meant weakness, and I was done letting someone else's comfort come before my own healing. Nora is older now, old enough to reach for me with both arms whenever I walk into a room, and every time she does, I'm reminded that the fight was worth every quiet, careful step it took. If there's one thing I'd want any of you to take from this, it's simple. The people who call you dramatic for having needs are often the same people counting on you never checking whether their concern is real. Check anyway. Write it down anyway. Protect yourself before you need to, not after. Would you have stayed quiet at that dinner table, or would you have said something the moment you overheard that phone call? Tell me in the comments. If this story moved you, hit subscribe, because Sophie Revenge posts a new story just like this one every single day, and you won't want to miss what's coming next.